am Joan M. Piazzi from Rochester, New Hampshire. I'm a southerner. Actually, I am from somewhere further south. I'm from Massachusetts, and my story takes place in the town where I spent my childhood, Whitman, Massachusetts. Anyone familiar with Whitman, Massachusetts? Well, it was just one of those little quintessential New England small towns. It was in the mid-1960s. They all were fairly interchangeable. For example, they all had the mom and pop grocery on the corner. Now, the one nearest where I lived was Kavicki's. And recently, my mom had started doing all of her weekly grocery shopping at the new First National. But on Saturday mornings, she would sometimes send me to Kavicki's for a few things that she would need for the weekend. Now, some of the older women in town still did all of their grocery shopping at Kavicki's, and often that was on Saturday mornings. So I would always try to get there fairly early, because there were these two women especially, Marge Powers and Jerry White. They must have been, good Lord, 65. They were old. You know, the blue hair, the orthopedic shoes, the support hose. They just don't make old ladies like they used to. Well, they would do their weekly grocery shopping on Saturday morning. Side by side, this was their gossip time. So they'd take their carts down those little narrow aisles, chatting the whole time. If you were behind them, you were there for the day. You just couldn't get out. So on one particular Saturday morning, I guess I must have been dawdling over my Captain Crunch or something. And by the time I got to Kavicki's, Marge and Jerry were holding court in the produce section. All the neighborhood women were gathered around. Mrs. Kavicki was organizing the onions into this very fancy pyramid. I couldn't interrupt, so I had to listen to the entire conversation. Now, the topic that day was men. It's a big surprise. Specifically, their husbands, and what fools they were. Marge and Jerry were actually having an argument as to who was married to the bigger fool. Well, we all knew how Marge's husband Skippy had made a fool of himself the summer before at the fireman's muster picnic. See, Skippy was always telling everybody, I know this sounds like the kind of conversation they only have in commercials, but he was always telling everybody that the only kind of ketchup he would eat was Heinz. He knew the difference between Heinz and those cheap store brands. He'd been to restaurants where he was sure that they were filling the Heinz bottles with something else. He hadn't had any other kind of ketchup for going on 11 years. Well, at this fireman's muster picnic, for which he had provided the ketchup, of course, Marge she did not want to hear that story one more time. So she decided that it was time to let Skippy know in front of the entire town that for the past 9 years, she had purchased 2 bottles of Heinz ketchup and had been refilling them with the store brand. And the only reason she bought the second one was because they changed the label design. Well, that just busted everybody up. Skippy got so mad that he got in his truck and went home, and Marge had to get a ride home later with the neighbors. Well, yes, everyone agreed. That is a very foolish way to behave. I don't know, said Jerry. I do agree that it is foolish, but what do you think of a man who will not get out of bed in the morning until I bring him the newspaper so that he can read the obituaries? My husband Randall will not get out of bed until he's read the obituaries to make sure that he's not dead. Well, everybody agreed that that was pretty foolish as well, and little me said, well, it sounds to me like one is as big a fool as the other. Oh no, said Jerry, Randall is clearly the bigger fool. No, said Marge, Skippy is the biggest fool in this town. I'll bet you, said Jerry, that in the next week, I can get Randall to do something more foolish than you can get Skippy to do. You're on, she said. And then the group of shoppers broke up, and I was able to get my onion and go home. So the next morning, being Sunday, Jerry went into the bedroom with the newspaper. Randall was propped up on the pillows waiting for it. But before she gave it to him, she looked at him. She said, Randall, are you feeling all right? Yeah, he said, reaching for the paper. But she held it back, and she put her hand on his forehead, and she peered into his eyes. She said, are you sure you're not feeling poorly? No, he said, I'm fine. Give me that paper. Then Jerry sat on the edge of the bed. What are you doing? He said. I'd like to read the obituaries this morning. Turn the page. So Jerry scanned the columns up and down, and she said, all right, not today. but I really don't like the way you look. She snatched the newspaper. She pushed him back down the bed, pulled the covers up to his chin, and she said, now you just stay here. I'll feed the dogs and make sure everything's taken care of. I'll explain to everybody why you're not at Mass today. You just stay here and rest. And she left. Well, a couple of hours later, after church, she went back, and Randall was sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling on his socks. She said, what are you doing? He said, I'm getting up. I gotta get those leaves raked. Oh, no, you don't. Not in your condition, she says. She pushed him back down. She said, open your mouth. Stick out your tongue. Oh, it's that bad. You are a sick, sick man, Randall. She pulled up the covers, and she went to the blanket chest at the end of the bed and got another blanket and put that on him. She said, now you just lie here. I'll get you some broth. So she left the room, and a few minutes later, she came back with a steaming bowl of soup. And from her apron pocket, she pulled a medicine bottle and a spoon. She says, here, this will make you feel better. Randall says, but I'm not sick. She said, oh, yes, Randall, you are terribly sick. And she stuck a spoonful of blackberry brandy into his mouth. And then she started to feed him the soup. Now, this was Jerry's own concoction of chicken broth and jalapeno peppers. In between every spoonful, she mopped the beads of sweat from his brow and his upper lip, and when the bowl was empty, she gave him another spoonful of medicine, just for, extra. She pulled up the covers. She got a comforter out of the blanket chest. She put that on top of him. She said, now you just take it easy. I don't want you to get excited. You just lie here, preserve your strength. I'll come back and check on you in a little while. Well, several times that day she went back and she gave Randall more medicine. She cranked up the wood stove, turned up the AC, and Randall lay there in bed, shivering and sweating and feeling that he really was very close to death. Several times over the next couple of days, she would go back and she would repeat this process. Now, next morning, she slept in the guest room that night, and the next morning she went in with a newspaper, and he said, where the hell have you been? She said, Randall, I was here beside you the whole night. You have been so fitful that you didn't even know that it was me. Now, the doctor said that cases like yours are rare and the prognosis isn't good, but the doctor, was he here too? Yes, Randall, he was here yesterday. This fever has you so out of your mind. And she gave him some more medicine. She fixed him some more soup. She put another blanket on top of him. Now, several times over the next couple of days, in ever decreasing time intervals, she gave Randall ever increasing doses of medicine, and his condition steadily worsened. Now, over at Marge and Skippy's house, I have to back up to Sunday morning, don't I? Skippy woke up to the sound of Marge's spinning wheel coming from the dining room. This was not at all unusual. See, Marge was one of those do-it-yourself Yankee type of girls. She didn't much go in for that polyester double knit stuff that they were selling out of the Sears catalog. She still spun and wove and sewed much of her own clothing. So hearing the spinning wheel was not unusual, but what Skippy saw when he got there was Marge was sitting at the wheel, her foot was rhythmically pushing the pedal, and her fingers were pulling something invisible from a seemingly empty basket at her feet. What are you doing? He asked. Isn't this something? She said. Joyce Cooper down the road, she just sheared that new black sheep she got, and she said the breed is so rare that if you shear it at the right time of the month, the wool develops magical powers. And they say that any man who doesn't trust his wife can't see it. Did you ever hear anything so ridiculous? He stared into that basket even harder. She said, now, I think I'm going to be here all day, but I made you an omelet, it's in the oven, and I got you a new bottle of ketchup. And so Skippy went into the kitchen, eating his eggs, staring at that Heinz bottle suspiciously, until he heard Marge call from the dining room, Skippy, could you come here a minute? And so he went to see what she wanted, and she said, could you bring me that basket of wool from over there? I am so stiff from sitting here that I don't even think that I could lift it. Well, Skippy went across the room, and he easily lifted this empty basket with one hand and brought it over and plopped it at her feet. Oh, my big, strong husband, she said, I don't think I tell you often enough how much I appreciate all of the help that you give me here at home. I'm going to do something for you. I'm going to make you a brand new suit. This wool is so beautiful. It is going to make the nicest, softest worsted, and I'm going to make you a brand new suit, because you haven't had a suit in years, and you deserve one. Thanks, said Skippy. Now, Skippy wasn't much of a reader, and he was probably absent the day the teacher read the Emperor's New Clothes, so he had no idea what was going on. And so all day long she spun, and then she wove, and that shuttle went back and forth, and then she took some great length of something and spread it out on the dining room table, and as her shears were snipping the air above the dining room table, Jerry was kneeling at her husband's bedside, and she clasped his hand in hers, and she said, "Now, Randall, I know we don't have much time left, but I don't want you to worry about me. It won't be easy for a while, but I will be all right. Now, I'm going to see Mr. Thomas today about a box, you know, the nice plain pine box that we've always talked about with a pretty blue lining. And so I just want you to lie here and think about your journey ahead and not get yourself all worked up." Well, it would have been hard for him to get anything up under all those pounds of blankets she had put on him, so he just did as he was told. The next morning, she came back with the newspaper. It was folded. She said, "Well, here it is, Randall. They said some awful nice things about you. I'm going to miss you, darling." And she touched his cheek and she left the room. And Randall lay there thinking, so this is what it feels like to be dead. Kind of like what it feels like to be drunk. His head was swimming behind his closed eyelids, and he was expecting at any moment to see a brilliant white light, but instead what he saw was his wife coming back. She was pushing that pine coffin on wheels, and she said, "Well, here it is, Randall. I hope you'll be comfortable in it." And she went to the closet and she got his best jacket and was just putting it on him at the very moment that Marge was buttoning up the jacket of Skippy's invisibly wonderful new suit. "There, now," she said, "don't you cut a dashing figure. Now, stand still so I can pin up your cuffs." Well, Skippy, he tried to stand still, but he was shivering. I mean, after all, he was only in his underwear, you know. And then he suddenly had this thought. He'd gone along with this invisible suit business up till now, but then he realized that it was almost done, and she was going to expect him to wear it somewhere. Now, he knew there were a lot of men in town who didn't trust their wives, and they didn't know anything about this magical wool business. Now, fortunately, Skippy didn't have an occasion to wear a suit very often. But just as she was tying off the last knot, the phone rang, and they learned that their dear friend, Randall White, had just passed on from a brief illness and would be buried 2 days hence. "Well," said Marge, "isn't it fortunate that you have your new suit to wear?" "Yeah," said Skippy. Well, the morning of the burial dawned bright and cold, and the small group of us followed that casket from the Holy Ghost Church out to the cemetery. The box, was open. Jerry had asked that it remain open until the last possible moment so Randall could enjoy the sun on his face one last time. Randall was quite the outdoorsman, after all. And so we all gathered around the gravesite, dressed in our somber clothes, except for one man in his long underwear and wingtip shoes. None of us could make eye contact with each other. We just stared at the ground with watery eyes. Poor Skippy, we thought, so grief-stricken at the death of his friend that he doesn't realize that he hasn't gotten dressed. And so Father Frawley opened his book and began his service. "Dearly BVD, beloved," he said, and that was all it took. You know that laughter when you're not supposed to laugh? Well, we just all roared with hysterics. And confused to the sudden change of tone, Randall sat up in his coffin and looked around, and the mourners all screamed and scattered, and Mrs. Kavicki collapsed into the open grave. The only one left standing there was the dearly BVD'd Skippy. "You're not dead," he said. "Well, you're not even dressed." Well, when Marge and Jerry stopped laughing and congratulated each other, the bet was declared a draw. And the title of The Biggest Fool in Whitman is, as far as I know, still up for grabs.